Welcome, everybody, to the 49th episode of the JewishDrink.com podcast and video show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm stoked to have Rabbi Josh Yuter join us today. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
My pleasure. So, Rabbi Yuter, just as a quick introduction, we'll get back more to him in his current podcast series. But Rabbi Yuter here he was ordained at Yeshiva University. He also has master's degrees from both University of Chicago and Yeshiva University in Talmud and sociology. Is that correct?
Yeah, sounds about right.
Talmud from YU, sociology from UC.
Yeah, that's right.
And computer science undergrad, right?
Yep.
Also from YU, from Yeshiva College. So I'm really excited to have Rabbi Yuter on. He joins us from Israel. And his podcast, which I'm going to discuss a little bit later in the show, is about midrashim. So I figured, what better way to talk about the midrashim and Bereshit Rabbah and Midrash Rabbah about the story of Lot and his daughters. So, Rabbi Yuter, welcome again, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Let's go.
Awesome. So, kicking off. So, I know people might have tuned in to previous episodes. Last year we had not one but two episodes on Lot and his daughters, one with Aaron Roller and one with Rabbi Aaron London, and both of those we really touched more upon the story, the actual story itself. This episode with Rabbi Yuter is more about the midrashim with Bereshit Rabbah. And just for those with a little bit of background, what the story is in Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 through 38 is Lot and his daughters are fleeing from Sodom. They ultimately make it out. They start out also with Lot's wife, but she doesn't make it. And Lot and his daughters make it to a cave. They survive this terrible destruction of multiple cities. And they think that not just the cities, but the entire world has been destroyed. So the daughters hatch a plan to repopulate the earth. It's just their father and them. And so what else do? You get your father drunk on successive nights. So the older daughter, the first night, they get their father intoxicated to a deep degree. And then the next night, the younger daughter does it. And it's just those two nights. They have apparently enough wine to get their father blisteringly totally gone, so totally drunk, and they succeed in their plan. They get pregnant and they then have sons. So I'm going to start off with the thing that I'm deeply fascinated by. So we find, just for those who are looking to keep score at home, all the midrashim that we're talking about here appear in Bereshit Rabbah chapter 51 in sections 8, 9, 10, and 11. And one thing that has been deeply fascinating me, I don't know about you, Rabbi Yuter, but I'm sure some people out there are also curious about this. If they escaped, I don't know how much time they had to gather their things and then flee from their house. And I don't know if they brought wagons, if they had donkeys, how much stuff they could, put with them in addition to whatever they could carry on their backs. But they had to carry food, probably some clothing, maybe some other personal items. But to carry the amount of jugs of wine necessary to get their father totally smashed, not once, but at least two nights in a row, that's a serious degree of wine. So,
or Lot was a lightweight.
Or very, very good. He very well could have been a lightweight. That is true. I don't remember if I discussed this in the episodes with Aaron Roller and Rabbi Aaron London, but I'm so deeply fascinated, but I'm not the only one. Thank God the rabbis were also curious. Wait a second, did they really bring this much wine? And I think the rabbis understand that it's possible they could have brought enough wine for the first night, perhaps, of getting their father incredibly drunk. But two nights, that's a really significant and serious degree of wine. I think for anybody, that's a lot of wine.
True. The one caveat that I would add here is that if I remember correctly, at least in the rabbinic times, I don't remember if this was true for biblical, the wine wasn't diluted. The wine was much, much stronger per volume, and you needed to water it down. Right. So not saying no, it's just, when you compare it to, say, your Moscato that you pull off the shelf, yeah, it's not that. You were talking about much higher concentrations of alcohol per volume. So, again, it still is a bit tricky.
Well, so for the rabbis, they must have been used to, so their typical dilution was a 3-to-1 ratio of dilution of water to wine. I don't know if they factor that in. They don't talk about this in Bereshit Rabbah as like, oh, they needed also water. Although that's another thing. Where do they get the water from? Do they get from the caves? Unclear.
I would also say that we don't really have a concept of time on how long things took after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So if I can make one observation from the Midrash,
Sure.
so this is from Genesis Rabbah 51:8. There's a line here at the very beginning, Shahayu sovarot shenitkala ha'olam kedor hamabul, that they thought that the world was destroyed like the generation of the flood. Now, what happened after the flood and Noah leaves the ark? What does he do in Genesis 9, let's say, really 20 on? He plants a vineyard and he gets himself drunk. Now, it took some degree of time, to plant the stuff and to keep going.
Right.
And maybe by making that analogy specifically to, the destruction of the flood, they were thinking kind of like Noah in a different way, planted something growing and got drunk, and maybe it just took some time, right? We seem to think like, oh, this happened just immediately. The Bible itself doesn't tell us, oh, and then after he went and he settled there. And, the daughters thought, hey, the world is destroyed and this is it. Because, you just see a massive apocalypse. You don't exactly want to go touring. So, could very well be that they just planted and they grew it just like Noah did after he came out of the ark. It's a guess.
Well, it's interesting look, there are a lot of similarities between Noah and Adam, like the creation of the world and having those things and the similarities, having something consumed, ultimately ending in a curse, right, between Adam and Noah. I like your similarities also between Noah and Lot and their sons and daughters as far as getting drunk, because both of them have drunkenness and both of them have the offspring of children that have certain vast tracts of land that the Israelites will ultimately conquer. There are lots of similarities for sure between Noah and his sons, Lot and his daughters, and drunkenness. I don't know how much Lot's daughters conceptualize themselves as following necessarily in the footsteps of Noah, but I like your read of it.
Well, I only made the connection because this was added in by the Midrash. So it could be that it's sort of evoking that connection in a bunch of different ways. It's not mentioned in the text of the Bible itself. This is the Midrash. So maybe that's, a point the Midrash is adding in.
I like that. Yeah, they thought it was just like the Mabul again.
Yeah.
God hitting the reset button on humanity.
Exactly. And, following the same pattern, sure, let's get drunk, and plant a vineyard. But again, you're like, as you really astutely point out, this is just trying to fill in just gaps in the text of where did this wine come from?
Right. And that's not a stretch at all. I think everybody reads that into it. They think that this was just like the Mabul, God's hitting the reset button on humanity and wiping everybody out. I think that's a totally reasonable, actually fairly shot-like read. Right. Okay. So, all right. So getting into the wine aspect, so thinking of where could this have come from, and we get not one but two possibilities from the Midrash, which I think are interesting. The first one is that the Midrash presents the possibility of people storing their surplus wine in these caves. The caves were a good place for storage, especially if maybe you didn't have room in your house, and also as well as, and this is no secret, but caves offering a better environment, a better temperature for storage of really anything, but especially wine. And so what the Midrash Rabbah posits here is that basically they're like, oh, great, there's a bunch of wine here, we're set. There's more than we can ask for, right?
It's also, very possible. They, just happened to come across a storage, or perhaps they were looking for one too. Meaning you think the world is destroyed, you think caves are a good, repository or safe. Stands to reason, like, Stowe might have been destroyed, but the caves might have been maintained from, fire and brimstone raining down from heavens. Caves are going to be protected. It's possible that they specifically looked for caves that already had resources in there, figured we're just going to help ourselves to them. You could argue that even for two reasons. One, based on all of the other midrashim about Sodom, they weren't that, careful about theft or personal property. The Gemara goes into much greater detail about just how corrupt they were. So it could be one, they just didn't feel too badly about taking someone else's stuff. And, they could have also reasonably assumed, well, if the world is destroyed, it's not like they're going to be needing it anymore, are they?
Right, they're already dead.
They're already dead.
What? No one can lay claim to these jugs of wine anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not really theft. They're already dead.
Yeah,
Fair
score.
Yeah.
They're
But
not coming back for it.
Yeah, but I do like your point about them looking for caves that might have been more, not just suitable for habitation, but things that clearly had been sort of domesticated in some way, as opposed to just sort of more of a feral cave, but something that clearly there looked to be, someone else had found it to be suitable for storage of human, items.
Mhm.
I like that observation.
Hmm.
So the other possibility that the Midrash posits is, it's actually, I think we have a name on this one. It's Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon. He says it's kind of like a microcosm of the world to come that happened, that, and sort of as wine, just as in the book of Joel, chapter 4, verse 18, that wine drips from mountains. So this is a similar instance, that it wasn't that wine was stored there, is that wine was actually dripping down from the mountains, and that somehow they were able to, I don't know, collect this wine dripping down in the mountain for their own consumption.
So it could have already been there.
What?
So when it says like the wine coming down, you can look at it two ways. Either one, sort of a miraculous thing that you had these
Yes.
plants that dripped wine,
Yes.
or maybe they just happened to plop down by a vineyard and similarly just maybe made their own too and have it take a little bit longer.
Could have
Either
been.
way.
It's an interesting, again, comparison with Noah, that they decided to plant a vineyard as opposed to bringing already prepared wine with them or having it there for their consumption.
But so it's an interesting thing though, where it says here, "Nasem lahem me'ein dugma shel olam haba," that it's like some image or analogy or example from the world to come, considering how much the sages, as you've done this way, way, way longer than I have. The sages had a very weird relationship with wine, right? And certainly weren't a
Weird?
huge fan of drunkenness.
I don't know about weird.
Well, they've had mixed opinions about it. They certainly weren't happy about a lot of things. So to say that wine's like well, I guess you have to tune into the other stuff in terms of exporting connections with licentiousness and all that stuff.
I think they had I think they had a comfortable relationship with wine. They definitely pointed out where people might have crossed the line, but I think it was very much part of the world of the sages.
Yeah. But, you think about Olam Haba and wine, is it good or bad? Given that they have, okay, let's say we will find places where they were critical of wine, and to calling it of it's almost like this, supernatural or heavenly type of thing or some otherworldly wine thing is, it's especially interesting when you see what happens with that wine afterwards.
Right. Daughters of Lot now, whereas we could argue with Noah, he had no idea, no one had ever had wine or alcohol ever in the history of humanity. Here, they know. They clearly know. This is the third appearance of wine in the Torah, the previous time being with Malki Tzedek bringing out wine and bread for Abraham after the War of the 4 and 5 Kings. Here we have wine, and they know. They know the effects of alcohol. And they also know what happened with Noah to some degree, that there's this connection between wine and sort of sexuality. And so they leverage it to their benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of what we see in Midrash Rabbah. They say, hey, let's use wine to our sexual benefit, take advantage of our father, that we could offer offspring to the world and continue to populate it, which is really fascinating also because both Adam and Noah both got the command to be fruitful, multiply. And it's almost as if they're taking this very seriously. Hey, wait a second. Just like the Mabul, right? Just as you mentioned, Midrash Rabbah, just as with the Mabul, the world's been wiped clean of humanity. We're back to square one. Our Father is not going to naturally have sex with us to repopulate the earth. We're going to leverage wine to our benefit and make this happen, right? So I don't see the sages and I don't even think it comes through even here in Bereshit Rabbah. I don't even see the sages as looking at wine in a negative light.
Not in this specific passage. I can say that with Noah, they were a little more critical of you just get out of the teva and the first thing you do is wine to get drunk, is, grape juice to get drunk. Like you could have planted anything else. So by there, it is a little bit more critical. Again, my issue here wasn't so much the criticism as much as, to say me'ein dukma shel olam haba, which is, considered something very sacred. and knowing what comes after that, to me seems interesting.
Wine's going to be part of Olam Haba. It's going to be here too. So so for me, I guess it's less interesting because I don't see wine as necessarily something of criticism by the rabbis.
Fair. And even so, in this case, the wine directly led to incest. And arguably rape, or at least the Gemara calls it rape. So, it's still to my mind, like, it's an interesting contrast of, you have something that's described, that Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon describes as something very spiritual. You might even call it the height of spirituality, that's used for something that the Torah and Chazal certainly frown upon in this specific instance.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll get there next.
Well, actually, I mean, this is a perfect segue because it continues of how much was Lot aware of this, right? How much awareness did he bring to the 2 nights of sexual encounter with his daughter? So also in Midrash Rabbah 51:8, what we see is that the rabbis really interrogate how much did he really, the biblical text said he didn't know when they got up and when they laid down. He had no idea. And the rabbis interrogate this. They say, what do you mean? He had to have some knowledge, right? So they point out, well, in the text, there's some dots over not knowing, right? And when she arose, okay? So why is when she arose dotted? Like, why is it singled out? Well, when she laid down, he really didn't know. But when she got up, somehow he had a sense of knowledge. He had some sort of sense of awareness. So they really... I mean, that's fascinating because in the biblical text, he's just sort of the object of their sexual action. He's not a subject. He doesn't have sexual license or sexual agency in the interactions. But the rabbis say that's preposterous. He had to have some knowledge or general awareness.
Right. Yeah, so you've got slightly different approaches to this. You have a parallel in the Babylonian Talmud on Nazir 23a, that really explicitly just reverses the whole issue of agency and responsibility of this, where the daughters is treated as almost righteous in terms of their intentions behind it, and it says explicitly that that the difference was shtei banotav imo shenitkavenu l'shem mitzvah, that the daughters of Lot had the intention to perform a commandment, to do a mitzvah. And whereas Lot had, l'shem aveira, Lot was, intended to sin, which is, a complete and total reversal of, what you would expect out of this. And as you correctly said, completely rereads the biblical verse to the exact opposite of what it says, saying, he did not know when he got up, to say, no, he did know. And then the Gemara even continues, says, Vaha manis anis, actually says that it was rape, which, I'm not sure how many people would acknowledge, that this was rape because it was, getting drunk and lack of consent that way. But the Gemara is very clear and calls it rape, and then adds that, well, he did know the second night. And then it says, well, what could he have done? And then the answer is, well, he shouldn't have gotten drunk the second night, meaning they're willing to give him a pass on night 1, but not on night 2. Meaning the fact that he got himself drunk the second night, he's on the hook for that one.
Well, because when the older daughter got up, right, in both in the Gemara here and Midrash Rabbah, both when she got up, the older daughter, then he had some knowledge. So they're coming into the second night, and that I think is what the stam there in Nazir 23a is picking up on. Is maybe that second night he should have known better.
Exactly. So they're willing to give him a pass on night 1, but not on night 2.
Yeah, which is interesting. Now it's in the biblical text, he's painted as he didn't do anything, he didn't know anything, and now the rabbis are shading him a little bit negatively.
Yeah, completely negatively. And like I said, it's a complete reversal. Like, when the Bible says this because in our Masoretic tradition, there happens to be a dot over it. Well, we're going to read this word to mean the exact opposite of what it means and paint Lot in a completely different light.
Yeah.
And not only that, but, the daughters are seen as righteous in a way that, they had intention to do a mitzvah, right?
Mhm.
Which is, not always the way that it's, perceived as, we'll probably get to in a bit. And that's also, I think a fairly important spin on this as well,
Yeah.
that it's willing to say, well, their intent was good and noble. So yeah, there's a lot of reading in here of stuff that is not only not in the biblical text, but in some
Mhm.
ways completely counter to what we find.
I'm going to just pick up on that and just transition to something a little bit further ahead, which is their sort of the nobility of their intent, right,
Mm-hmm.
of the daughters. So what we see in Midrash Rabbah so it's still chapter 51, but the sort of the 11th section, which is that they did it l'shem shamayim.
Mm-hmm.
That well, we have Rabbi Huna saying, well, from the beginning, actually, of Moab's pregnancy, it had only been done for l'shem shamayim. It had been done for the sake of heaven and not for just sort of fornication or sort of illicit, sexual activity. So, and also, although there's another, Rabbi Simon argues that no, it's the exact opposite. It wasn't done l'shem shamayim. She actually just really wanted to do it, just to be licentious. But there's an interesting, still, that's something that plays in the rabbis' disagreement, and it continues. There's some other opinions there of like how much really was it just simply like they just wanted to I don't know, cross the lines sexually, or how much it really was intentional with the l'shem shamayim, and specifically what I mentioned back to both the commandments to both Adam and Noah about being fruitful and multiplying as being these sort of forever commandments to humanity. And just like they had to sort of start a new world, both Adam and Noah, and having to be fruitful, being the puravu, being fruitful and multiplying. Here too, they're starting at the beginning of a new world, and they have to engage in this sort of activity.
Yeah, and I kind of see with rabbis' discussions about this in terms of the nobility of the intention and should they have done this, should they not have done that, with the Gemara that talks about Yibum, the levirate marriage. Forgive me, I don't have that loaded up. It just came to me that, initially, there's when a woman's husband passes away and they don't have kids, if he has a brother, he is supposed to marry her in a certain levirate marriage and otherwise performs a ritual called chalitza. And even in time of the Gemara, they were, sort of cool to actually performing Yibum and would sort of nudge towards doing chalitza, even though Yibum was still a commandment, because people would be doing it not for the proper intent. So in that case, you have, on one hand, when you're dealing with, sexual matters, yes, on one hand, there could be a mitzvah. On the other hand, there's also this weird concern. I want to say weird concern. There's also this concern that if your motives are not 100% totally pure, there's something wrong with it, even if you're trying to do a mitzvah. Right. So you look at something here, and yes, you've got, a couple of statements that seem to read very much either, in favor of the women. Certainly don't think they did anything wrong because given their mindset, they were in a completely, traumatic, experience. And others, say, well, no, they were just using this as an excuse to do what they wanted to do anyway. And in theory, they could both be true, like psychologically, like they're not mutually exclusive. They're just kind of giving you two sides of the same coin, depending on which thing you want to look at. Although granted, the first one is more attested in the biblical text itself, but yeah.
It's so fantastic. I really hadn't thought about something you just mentioned, which is the traumatic aspect of this, and not only just losing their world, right? All their friends, everybody they know, but their mother also. Like they just lost their mother in transition in this liminal period between stone and the cave, and now they're getting to the cave. They're safe, and their mother's not with them.
Yeah. Oh, and let's not forget that Lot kind of offered them to a mob. Right? That's got to do something for you too, right?
Right. That's also got to mess with them traumatically, sexually. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's hiding them from. He's offering them. Yeah. That's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're trying to get into their their mindset, Yeah, I think that, maybe that had something up in there too. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um,
This-
yeah.
But going in, I'm going to bring up another thing from Midrash Rabbah, which also colors Lot a little bit more in the negative, also from Bereshit Rabbah here, which is we see in 51:9, which is how much had there been any attraction between Lot and his daughters and Lot. The biblical text, we get nothing out of this. We have no evidence, and really it seems that the daughters are really just doing it for the utilitarian purposes of repopulating the earth. But the rabbis ask, wait a second, was there any attraction that was operable, whether pre-destruction or now that they find themselves in the cave? But this is interesting because Rabbi Yudin of Galila and Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman, both quoting Rabbi Eliyahu, and he says, we don't know whether did Lot lust for his daughters or did his daughters lust for him, on the basis of what is said in the following verse from Proverbs 18:1, he who separates himself seeks desire. So this is what the rabbis say. It is clear that Lot lusted after his daughters, which is it's just kind of crazy that they're pulling out from this verse in Proverbs that actually Lot had been desiring his daughters. So once again, in the biblical text, there's nothing as far as Lot desiring his daughters. If anything, what you just mentioned, offering his daughters to the men of stone, it's as opposed to keeping them for himself, it would seem to suggest that he has zero sexual desire intent for them. And yet the rabbis pull out from 18:1 in Proverbs and say, oh, wait, he did, which is a little bit of a shocker. I don't know about your thoughts.
Yeah, it could be, or it could just be a matter of, not that he didn't desire them, but he thought of them as just, sexual objects. Like we don't know Lot's mentality either.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot we don't know.
No,
I could also.
It's true that there's a lot that we don't know, but it's all the more fascinating the rabbis are plucking this out and connecting it from Proverbs to here and saying that he did.
Right. So there's a theory I could offer in terms of like why they would want to say this. There's a line, again, forgive me, I just reminded myself now, that there's an opinion, I believe, attributed to Rava of Ein Kishoy Below Da'at, that a man doesn't have an erection unless there's knowledge or at least some degree of intent. If this was a standard view among the rabbinic sages, that could give them an impetus to read some desire into Lot, because if you could only have an erection when there's, even if you're drunk, there's still some degree of knowledge there behind it. If this is how they understood, the human body and the relationship between, the physical and the emotional, well, here's a good reason, that may compel you to reinterpret things in a way to say, well, Lot clearly did desire his daughters, otherwise he wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Again, speculating.
Yeah. It's something that they could have connected, even if Rava's statement might have come later than these earlier rabbis.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have my chart here of when and where each one lived. So yes, it's quite possible that they didn't know of it, or they may not have agreed with that. But this opinion is attested in rabbinic literature, and perhaps it was a common view at that time. Who knows?
Yeah. So one thing that was kind of curious to me was pregnancy in the first time. This is another thing that Midrash Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah picks out, which is it even, the rabbis seem to think that it's impossible to get pregnant on one's first time having sex. And yet this is not what happens here. And we see in Midrash Rabbah 51:9 that basically what the girls did was to try to provoke their own sort of genitalia into thinking that they had already had sex. So when they had sex with their father, it provided this opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, we also see that with, which is interesting, also in the biblical text, we see Yehuda and Tamar, right? Yehuda and Tamar, it seems that it was just a one-off, it was just a one-time thing, and yet twins. So it's, at least biblically, it doesn't seem to not happen. It happens here. It happens with Yehuda and Tamar getting together. But it's an interesting thing that those sages are trying to work out. Wait a second, does it ever happen
Yeah, if I'm remembering right, there's also a line in the Bavli how you don't get pregnant if you have sex standing up. Um, so they weren't entirely accurate with the biology. Um,
Yeah.
we can know that now, and you may even be able to find like other examples, in the like, there, yeah, it certainly is an odd statement. And then
Yeah.
like, I would sooner ask, well, why is he making this statement? Like, does he have like some basis for for making the statement factually? And then I
Mhm.
would ask midrashically, what is he trying to, add by pointing this statement out? Meaning,
Yeah.
there's one thing like if it's true. And also I should point out another, caveat here is that yes, by today's standards, we know that they got the science wrong. Which is considering when they lived, okay. It's also possible that they were following, sort of the norm. I mean, the language is Rabbi Eliezer said, "Olam enisha mit aberet mibia rishona," that forever it's like a very permanent categorical thing that happens. It could be he could acknowledge an exception here or there, but then it wouldn't be olam because that sort of negates even the possibility of an exception.
Yeah.
Trying to, sort of give him the benefit of the doubt. It's a very harsh sort of language because there are times when, you'll find rabbinic sages that will make very general categorical statements, will acknowledge exceptions, but say, the exceptions are exceptions. And, we don't care about the exceptions or we don't care about miracles. When you say something like olam, that's a very emphatic categorical statement. So yeah, there's a lot to ask there. Again, both what scientific basis did he have for that, or some textual midrashic basis, and otherwise, why interject that here? And I would guess it's trying to convey something more about the personality of Lot's daughters, in terms of like trying to. It's I think it's you could try to say that he's trying to elaborate a bit on the intent of the sexual act, maybe to show either that they were either that desirous or they did whatever they could to ensure that they would get pregnant the first time out so that they wouldn't have to do it again. Right.
Right.
So you could read this as a way of, either way, like, it's just like, but, let's try to, keep it in the more favorable thing that this was just their way of trying to ensure, completely practical, pragmatic. We're going to do whatever we have to do to get pregnant once. That's it. No more. And yeah.
I think what's fascinating is what the Midrash does not, the path that the Midrash does not go down. One possibility the Midrash could have gone down is saying, okay, on the first night the older daughter, the second night the younger daughter, and then afterwards they said to themselves, wait a second, don't we want to increase our chances of actually succeeding in our mission here? Let's continue doing this, especially since we might have a lot of wine, right? I'm actually kind of surprised the Midrash doesn't offer that as another narrative expansion, as a potential read for what was going on, that they only relied on those first two nights and that was it.
So it could very well be. Again, we don't have really a concept of time here.
But I'm saying for the Midrash, though.
Yeah.
Why doesn't the Midrash go down that path?
My speculation would be this, let's say, I mean, I don't know how they would know, like, oh, we got pregnant our first night out, how a woman would know that they're pregnant immediately.
Yeah.
Why, or here would be my thoughts. Again, trying to read them more positively. They tried once, figured, okay, we had sex with our father. We're going to wait a bit and see what happened, rather than keep on trying to do it and see, well, did this work? So, okay, fine, they're pregnant. You got another 9 months or so. Let's not forget that both of them had boys, right? If your intent was to repopulate the world, you're not going to be able to do it with just 2 boys, right? You're going to need other females. So unless, they were already planning on having, more kids with them afterwards, but also let's not forget, because we have no concept of time, you figure, let's say they waited a bit to make sure that they were pregnant. Then they were pregnant for 9 months and then had a kid. It would presumably take a while for the kids to grow up too. By that point, they could have already been, reintroduced to society and realized, hey, wait a second, we don't need to do this anymore, right?
Right. It could have
So,
been a few months afterwards. Like you said, they start exploring. Maybe they come across people. There's no emerging from the cave story here,
right.
whether in the biblical text or in the Midrash, although the rabbis do have emerging from the cave stories themselves,
Hmm.
right? But here we just don't have that as part of the
Yeah,
narrative.
and there's no discussion of like what was their mentality afterwards.
Mm.
Like, hey, the world's destroyed. We should have sex with our fathers. Like, oh, wait a second. Like, yeah.
Right. Well, I'm going to use that and transition a little bit, which is one of the fascinating things that we see in 51:11, sort of towards the end of this 51st chapter, Midrash Rabbah, is about the naming and how
Hmm.
much sensitivity or I don't know, I want to say kavod, honor to the father. So we see towards later on in the end of the 51st chapter of Bereshit Rabbah here that the first one sort of dismissed the kavod of their father, sort of I want to say dishonored almost, that they
Hmm.
dishonored, the older one dishonored her father's name by saying, well, this is Moab, this is from my father, right? But the younger daughter had I don't know, some sort of mercy for her father, and in naming the second one, instead of calling out specifically her father in the naming of her son, calls it
Hmm.
Ben Ami, right? Amon, that it's from my people. It's indirectly referencing the father, whereas the first one dispensed with the honor of the father with the
Yeah.
naming.
I
What's
should
your
also add, I'm sorry?
Well, I was going to say it's a nice little addition by the rabbis to say little going into their minds and think about the mentality of like, man, the older, like the younger ones saw what her older sister had done and referring to their father in the naming of it and said, oh, that's not really honorable. I'm gonna have concern over my father's honor and not directly reference my father in the naming of my son.
Yeah. And then at the very end of that, paragraph is you have a complete reversal of everything. Where Rav Yochanan is cited as, the daughters holachot la'avor aveira, right? So one, even though we had that other, even though the Gemara Nazir said like, hey, they intended to do a mitzvah, here he's saying, well, they went to go and sin, right? Putting their actions in a more negative light, and they still got pregnant. So how would that happen? And it says, bischut Moav, right? In the merit of Moab, Mi'av, who being their father, Shne'emar ba'Avraham, right? So
Yeah.
in a weird, complete, negation of both sides of the equation, not only, was their intent bad, but they were pregnant from the real Moab, and the real Moab is Avraham. And just throws everything that we said completely on its head.
Right.
Yeah. Midrash is fun.
which is a clever move by the rabbis.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Well,
also you get to like throw in another, let's not forget that Ammon and Moab, weren't that nice to the Jewish people, later on down the line. So, when you say like, well, yeah, of the two, we're going to say Moab is worse because like their entire nation, the name of their nation evokes, incest. And like, you're supposed to remember this all the time is, yeah, something to keep in mind, as you go down and see the relationship between Ammon and Moab down the line.
well, that's something I mentioned in my what happened to Noah, the episode I did like a year ago with Professor John Bergsma, which is you see these similarities between Canaan, Ammon, and Moab. And what's the similarity between all these three nations? Well, they all came out of drunken incestuous relations, and they ultimately are the lands that the Bnei Israel conquered.
Yeah.
These nations had originated out of incestuous drunken relationship, sexual encounters, and now the Jews get to inherit these lands because it was almost as if these nations in their origins, in their origin story, but in their very origin were, I don't know,
Tainted. Original
what?
sin.
The original sin, right? But they were like sinfully created. They were created out of a non-righteous action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. So I want to transition. This is a great conversation. Thank you, Rabbi Yuter. I want to talk about what's going on with your new Midrash podcast, which is called "What's the Point of the Midrash?" So,
Yeah.
I know you've had a couple episodes that have come out in tandem with the weekly Parsha reading. So you're going through Bereshit Rabbah, right? Or Midrash Rabbah?
Yeah, the goal is to go through initially something on a midrash related to that week's parsha. Usually Midrash Rabbah. At some point, I may throw in a Gemara here or there if I find it interesting. And the concept is an idea I'm stealing completely from Rav Tendler. Rav Moshe Tendler in YU, whose year I was in, he would teach midrash from Bereshit Rabbah on Thursdays as part of Shir, like before he got out at the end of the week. And he would always ask, what's the point of the midrash? Because he would say, well, you don't want to take everything literally, you don't take everything figuratively, and you've got a bunch of midrashim that are mutually exclusive. It's two things that cannot possibly be true at the same time. So, given that, but what underlying truth could you have in these midrashim? So the type of question to ask, there's so many ways of, learning midrash is, what is the message that's trying to be conveyed here? And there's so many directions you can take this in. And when I was in my shul, I used to lead a discussion on this every Friday night as my Friday night for Torah. I would throw out a midrash or a couple of lines, didn't have time for something huge, and we just have a really wonderful discussion, and people would throw in all these ideas back and forth. And it was just something which I just really appreciated, because I think I don't think enough people take midrash seriously, assuming that they're even aware of the whole depth of it. I found conventionally most people are only familiar with the midrash that Rashi happens to quote. And there could be another midrash or like even the same paragraph that has a completely opposite idea. And if you take Rashi's explanation as, well, no, this is what the Torah means, it's not so simple. And not to say it's necessarily wrong, as much as there's a message that could be being conveyed here. What might that message be, or what are some possibilities of a message? What could it contrast with? How does it fit in with other stuff? And it's more of trying to spark a conversation than come up with any answer, because rarely is it going to be very clear of here's why this midrash is being said. And sometimes you could have it sparked by an exegetical ambiguity, like a pronoun that could go either way. And that says, oh, well, this means this and this means that. And then it's like, okay, that's why you started, but why did you go in this direction? And where does that take? And, the rules change based on, per week, and never know what you're going to find, or I never know what I'm going to find, or connections I make. But that's part of the fun, as you know from your own study of Midrash.
Yep, for sure. For sure. All right. Well, this is great. And if people wanted to find your What's the Point of Midrash podcast, how would they find it?
It's just search for What's the Point of the Midrash on iTunes, Spotify, and Google.
Awesome.
Or you could visit my website at joshyuter.com.
All righty. Well, Rabbi Yuter, this is great. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. This is a lot of fun. And l'chaim.
Awesome. And l'chaim.